Welcome to the show. On May 21st, I was privileged to appear as a guest on the Jon Dowling Show to discuss human health and physiology. Most of Jon's questions were based on my book, Body Science. As always, Jon's questions were well thought out, eliciting information that allows his audience to live their best lives. If you'd like to live your healthiest life, you can pick up a copy of Body Science from my website, drreality.news, drreality.news. I also want to let you know I'm offering free shipping on any order that contains Income Tax Shattering the Myths, which reveals the wonderfully liberating truth that Congress has never imposed the income tax on ordinary, hardworking Americans like you. To get free shipping, make sure Income Tax Shattering the Myths is in your cart and use the coupon code TARIFS at checkout. I'll talk a bit more about the truth of the income tax at the end, so stay with me for that. Now, let's get into the Jon Dowling interview.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I am Jon, your host, and we have a very special guest back. You saw him quite a bit last year in regards to income tax, how you can get around that legally and lawfully. He also helped you understand better the core competency of common law trusts and the various trusts within revocable and irrevocable, what will work best for your personal needs and or direction. And he's also talked about health and fitness. Given his background, it's quite apropos. And he has been gracious enough to join us back again. Part two, as you recall, Dave is a military man, retired. He's also specially trained in weapons training and also in martial arts. So obviously that lends itself well to health and fitness to be conducive. So he's a subject matter expert on that, among other things. And we are honored to have him back on the podcast with a book that I've read several times and read again this week for posterity. So I wouldn't dare be out of place with him. And we have the one and only Mr. Dave Champion back with us. Dave, how are you today, good sir?
I'm great, Jon. Good to be back again. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you. We're better for it for having you, and thank you for all your service. And we honor you on this somber Memorial Day upcoming in the next few days. So, Dave, getting started right off the bat with you, in your book, Body Science, you discuss a lot of what I like to call reverse engineering items. You know, one seminal example would be ketosis versus glucosis. You spent a lot of time establishing the parameters of that, and rightly so. How did you come to this distinction, and when was the first time you discovered this body hack?
Oh, so many years ago now. It's. I'm sure you have the same experience, Jon. You look back and you say, "How did all this time go by?" So many years ago, probably approaching a decade ago, I saw a fellow at the gym who had always been obese. He was a lifter, but he was always obese. And I looked across the gym and I said, that looks like Sean, but that can't be Sean because that guy's not obese. And shortly thereafter, the guy turned around and I was like, holy cow, that's Sean. So I made a point of going over to talk to him at some point during the gym time. And I said, where's the other half of you? And he started telling me about this diet that he was on that was 80% dietary fat. And I heard him out. And to be honest, my thought at the time was, yeah, I was born at night, but not last night. You're not going to convince me that eating 80% fat causes you to lose like 160 pounds, right? But in the same breath, I was seeing it with my own eyes, right? So I got home. I told Jan, I said, man, I saw Sean. I recounted the whole story to her. I said, I've got to look into this thing called the keto diet. Okay. That was my first exposure, this thing called the keto diet, which, as you know, having read Body Science, that's not really the thing. It's a mechanism, a tool to get somewhere. But I started doing the research, and down the rabbit hole I went. And that eventually produced Body Science.
Got it. Thank you for that. Very good, succinct and yet powerful explanation. It makes complete sense. In chapter 3, you discuss the subject of what I call, or what I believe you called, bio-individuality and the dichotomy between male and female genetics. How much, in your estimation, does this play a role in terms of how the different genders think and process the notion of food nutrition?
Ooh, wow. That's more of a psychological question. I don't know if that's in my wheelhouse, but I will give it my best shot. So first of all, let me start. When I was 15, I thought by the time I was like 30, I would understand women. I'm 65. I have still failed at that at 65. So take what I'm about to say with the appropriate grain of salt.
Sure.
So in generalizing, women tend to make more decisions, especially about household things, diet, kids, husband. They tend to make decisions from, I don't want to say an emotional perspective, but I think they factor in more emotions. How's that? Um, Men, we tend to keep everything compartmentalized, and we'd like to at least believe that we're making decisions predominantly based on facts. So I don't know. I think the emotional side likes comfort food. The emotional side um, likes sort of the way it's always been kind of thing. Um, I have noticed this is, I can't prove this. Let me be very clear about that because I like to distinguish between what I observe versus what I can prove. Um, I have observed that men seem to grab a hold of the whole ketosis issue more readily. They're more willing to accept it. But boy, I'll tell you, on social media, there are so many females that follow me that live in ketosis. So I don't know how to quantify the difference, but I know men tend to grab onto it more rapidly and they want to dig into every single aspect. And I love that.
Sure. No, and that's fair. I mean, it's just more of an open-ended discussion because sure.
If we may, let's return for a moment to bioindividuality rather than gender.
Sure.
Because this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. You might have got that in the book a little bit, although I don't phrase it that way. So we've got people who live in ketosis, and then we have everybody else, right? The other 99%, 98% that's living in glucosis. And the response I get from a lot of people is, not everybody's body is the same. Not everybody's body reacts the same or needs the same diet, blah, 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 blah. It's this reactive response when you say, ketosis will solve this and that and the other and so forth. So I just want to be clear that, yes, there is some predominantly genetic bioindividuality, but that's such a trivial part of the human experience. So, for instance, if Frank eats a 16-ounce steak and Joe eats a 16-ounce steak, even though Joe may say, not every diet is for everybody, Joe's body processes proteins, carbohydrates, and fat the exact same way Frank's body does. So I say that to make the point that a lot of this bioindividuality, while it does exist, usually when you hear it out in the in a discussion about ketosis or not being in ketosis or the keto diet or the carnivore diet, when you hear people say, well, everybody's different, that's a justification to do what they want to do. Their body doesn't function any differently, John, than yours or mine. At least in terms of the issues we're discussing today.
The anatomical aspects. Yeah, no, I get that.
Yes.
And I would just add to what you said, David, rightly, that women I've met in person and also, of course, social media, of course, and, social media has its own varying degrees, right? People are putting their best foot forward, putting out a certain precept of who they want you to see. So not everybody, but in general,
very true.
Yeah. Generalization's there for a reason. That's the general rule of thumb. But what I was going to say is, I think my experience has been a lot of high value women don't even understand their gender. So what chance do we have? So we're not alone. If they're confused, you got to give us a little bit of grace, So, but it's an interesting subject to ponder because while people's bodies do anatomically work the same, obviously we produce testosterone, they estrogen. So there are factors. It was at least, I thought, worth exploring the topic, from a certain
sure.
way. So,
and there's a group of people out there who claim that living in ketosis presents physiological challenges for women. I haven't seen a shred of evidence to support that, not one.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. Fair enough. Well, that's factors perfectly, David, into the talk track of our dialogue because you set me up indirectly with our good working relationship together. That we all have different blood types, and you and I have talked about this before, based on our genetic code and family bloodline. For example, I have AB positive, where someone else may have type O negative, type A positive, type B negative, and so on. How much of a mitigating factor do people's various blood types factor in terms of what they should or shouldn't eat relative to their specific blood type and overall needs thereof?
So that became a very popular theme back in the 90s, was to eat for your blood type. I think there's even a book with that title. However, again, this goes back to something I mentioned a moment ago. The fellow who has, I don't know, A positive, and I'm O negative, okay? We process dietary protein exactly the same. We process dietary fat exactly the same. We process carbohydrates exactly the same. Now, one could make the argument, I suppose, that once the intestines have done their job and the aminopeptides have entered the blood and the carbohydrates have gone to the liver and so forth, somebody could make the argument, I suppose, that based on our blood type, what our body chooses to do with those raw building blocks is very minimally different than what another blood type, a human with another blood type's body would do. Again, I haven't seen any evidence of that. I'm open to somebody actually proving it, showing that the proteins fold differently in people with A negative blood rather than they do A positive blood, that proteins fold differently, or a slightly lesser or greater percentage of protein does this or such, or the carbohydrates being converted in the liver to glucose and put out, into the bloodstream. I'm sorry, converting glucose into LDL and putting it out, triglycerides. I suppose somebody could say, well, O plus is like this, and A minus is like, okay, yeah, A negative, excuse me. But you get the point. There may be some trivial distinction, but in the macro theme of the difference between, for instance, glucosis and ketosis, there is no known difference.
So, in other words, it's basically negligible. The difference, it's so minuscule,
if at all.
Okay.
And again, I'm open to somebody actually doing that research, and I'd love to see it. There is no research to support that at this time.
Again, the idea here, David, is, because we've covered this in the past, this is a reprise, discussion podcast about body science because, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, we're just exploring different parts of things that we haven't covered to try to round it out for the audience's sake, as you can appreciate. Sure. So in chapter 4, you heavily stress the importance and distinction between the lymphatic lipid system, LLS, and the hepatic lipid system, HLS. Can you kindly explain the difference to the audience, the inherent difference between the two, and what role they play in the body in terms of overall digestion, as well as the body's ability to process more nutrients?
Sure. By the way, I should say, if some of your audience is saying, I've never heard of this thing called glucosis, or I've never heard of the lymphatic lipid system or the hepatic lipid system, they are absolutely right, because I had to create those names because these are systems. They're A to Z systems that the medical community, in its hundreds and hundreds of years of existing, has never named. So you can't talk about something that you don't name. Okay. So, for instance, with ketosis, that was a name, right? Back in the 1920s, ketosis. The alternative, the only alternative, didn't have a name. The one that 99% of the population of the world lives in didn't have a name. It was just like, they just said like the usual. Yeah. So I had to name it. The same thing with the hepatic lipid system and the lymphatic lipid system. Those are titles I had to make up in order to, so my readers could make sense of what we were talking about. So the lymphatic lipid system, this is where your body breaks down fats in the digestive tract, and they package them in chylomicrons, and the chylomicrons then transit the intestinal wall, and they go immediately into the lymph system. Okay, so that's the path. You eat the fat, it goes down into the gut. It is emulsified. It's not digested in the same sense the carbohydrates and proteins are. It's emulsified It's then packaged in chylomicrons, which are structurally similar to LDL particles, different but the same, and transits the intestinal wall. From there, it goes into the lymph system. It goes up through the lymph system and dumps into the primary portal vein that goes into the heart. Okay, into the chest cavity. Excuse me. And so at that point, all these chylomicrons are no longer in the lymph system. Poof! They now go into the blood system. And they travel throughout your body to all 100 trillion cells of your body. And basically, in the book, I analogize them to a delivery vehicle. So, here comes the guy with the truck, and I got a bunch of triglycerides in the back, and there's some swapping of HDL particles and so forth that signal unlock the truck, open the doors, and then the truck docks with the cell, and the triglycerides are offloaded to the cells. Then the doors lock again, and the truck continues to offload to various cells until it's completely depleted of its stores, and then it goes back to the liver where it is cannibalized. All right. So that's the lymphatic lipid system. And I think the important thing I would want your audience to take away as we talk about the lymphatic lipid system, number one, that's how all 100% of dietary fat gets into the cells. We should start with that. Secondly, the other thing I would want to say is if we go back 30,000 years ago, that was the only way it was happening. Okay, there was no other way for fat to get into the blood because people back then lived in ketosis from birth till death. Okay, so now in our modern carb-heavy, ultra-processed food society, what happens is blood glucose gets elevated dramatically. That's very unhealthy for the body. So then the pancreas starts pumping out insulin to bring that down. Well, insulin sends several signals throughout the body, but one of the signals it sends is to the liver. And it says, as the blood is passing through, you need to pull all this glucose out and you need to convert it to triglycerides. And you need to get those triglycerides out into the blood system. Now, so you'll notice there's a parallel here. Whether it's the lymphatic system or the hepatic lipid system, they're both putting triglycerides into the bloodstream. However, the lymphatic system is the daily operating system of the body and was for millions of years. The hepatic lipid system is an emergency mechanism that our ancient ancestor didn't need predominantly because they ate very few carbohydrates. And it's an emergency mechanism in the sense that, oh my gosh, look at these incredibly high numbers on glucose. We've got to get this out of the blood. This is harming the organs and the tissues of the body. So the only way for the body to do that, which is kind of magical actually, is for the liver to convert the glucose into triglycerides, which then go into, I think what the public, there's a progression, but well, for the sake of this discussion, we'll call them LDL particles, okay? And so LDL particles then, doctors like to count LDL particles, right? So the number of LDL particles will be dramatically less in a person where the liver is not converting glucose to triglycerides and putting them out. Now, here's probably the real kicker about this. The cells have already gotten their fat from the lymphatic lipid system, from the chylomicrons. Mm-hmm. And I told you chylomicrons and LDL are very structurally similar. So here comes these LDLs, and they're like, fat for sale, who wants some fat? And the cells are like, dude, we already saw the chylomicrons. The other fat salesman was already here, thank you, okay? And then, of course, that all ends up getting stored in the adipose tissue, and that's when we gain weight and we're overweight, and eventually, if this cycle continues on and on and on, as it is with most of the population in America, then we have this obesity crisis. I hope I tied all those things together a bit.
You did beautifully. And yes, we're going to talk about the standard American diet because that's been addressed in the book and it's wholesale throughout society. So you're right. You touched on a couple of really key points that go to my next following questions, which is, again, another naturally, beautifully, we'll say engineered or just organic segue. Not to get political by any means, but I think you and I are we know each other well enough that we have the same similar political persuasion, but that's not really the point. Again, we have to discuss the elephant in the room because it falls under this category. And I'm talking about with the new administration, RFK Jr. has been appointed to his new role as Director of Health and Human Services, DHS. he has declared an all-out war on processed foods, more specifically artificial dyes, colors, and anything that goes into mass-produced food, as you touched on earlier. How encouraged are you about his initiatives, and what long-lasting effects do you think this will have on the future of food production going forward?
Okay, so mixed bag. Let me start there. I tend to be an optimistic person, but I like to temper optimism with what I at least perceive as reality. So here's the reality. Um, Ultra processed food. There's no law in America outlawing it. Okay. So there's no way, I don't care, um, you know, who's in charge. You're not going to make something that's completely legal go away. Okay? Um, and I don't know if in America, in a land of liberty, we want to tell companies you can't produce that product because we say, and we can prove, it's bad for people. So is ultra processed food the same, for instance, as tobacco? I don't know. We still let people smoke, right? Is it as bad as heroin? We don't let people shoot heroin, right? That's a crime. So we've got these issues. Now, more directly to the MAHA movement, right? And RFK Jr. Let's talk about, for instance, food dyes, right? So one of the things that I've spoken of, not here, but in other forums,
Right.
is, for instance, we'll use, because it's something that I enjoy drinking, we'll use Powerade Zero, right? They're something berry, mixed berry flavor, I think is what they call it. It has blue number one in it, which is one of the things that HHS wants to make go away, blue number one. So, okay. So one of the reasons I've been critical of people who say, oh, you can't have anything with blue number one. They never talk about something called acceptable daily intake, ADI. And to give you some idea, ADI it comes about through quite a number of tests that take place over many, many years. And it seeks to provide a number where you can say, okay, you can safely consume this much of this thing, whatever it is. But once you get to this threshold, when you get there or above, some people have some adverse health consequences. Okay. And I think that's the ADI is a realistic thing because the body is not so fragile, right? So I was always critical of people who wanted to condemn, for instance, blue number one or any of the other non-natural food dyes without consideration of ADI. Let me give you an example. In a 28-ounce Powerade Zero mixed berry, there is the amount of blue number one that's in it. For me to reach the ADI threshold, I would have to drink 303 28-ounce bottles in a single 24-hour period.
Wow.
Okay. So if I drink three, just as an example, throwing that out arbitrarily, if I drink three, okay, that's 300 bottles short of reaching the point where blue number one might do something adverse to my health. So I share that. Then I look at what RFK Jr. is doing. Wholesale ban on blue number one and several others, but
Right.
on blue number one without ever talking about ADI. Okay, so whether we've got people condemning it over here out in the blogosphere, whether we've got RFK Jr. saying it needs to go away, there's no discussion of relevant factors like ADI. So I'd like to see a bit more science and a bit more common sense involved. That said, and what I'm about to say, I think goes more to your point.
Sure.
I don't know what RFK Jr., how successful he's going to be at creating a healthier America moving forward for the next, 3 3/4 years. But he's a damn sight better than anyone who's been in that chair in the last several decades.
I agree completely.
Now, by the way,
Right.
I am very disappointed in things like I was hoping day one, get sworn in, turn around and say, I'm going to release all the data that HHS has on SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, and the mRNA products. Everything we've got, the American people should be able to see.
Yep.
Well, that didn't happen, and it still hasn't happened. And why is that? I'm going to speculate. After Donald Trump was elected, but before he was sworn in, he had 2 private dinners with Borla, who is the CEO of Pfizer. And now there's no discussion of releasing the information to the American people. That does not please me.
So, yeah, we get down a slippery slope with this, which I understand. Let's address this bit by bit if we can, because it's a big elephant.
Sure.
It's an elephant. You got to process one bite at a time. So, I'm not a proponent of processed foods, neither are you. Their whole book is heavily based on eating as natural and direct to the source of, farm and
Yep.
animals as possible. At the same time, you don't want to take away people's free will to make their own choices, because that's a God imbued gift, which I believe in, God believes in, and everybody has the right to determine, what's best for them, and someone should not take that free will from them, for better or for worse, right? So that's kind of my take on that, for what it's worth. I can, as I've told you in the past, when we've gone back and forth with things, I can show you some articles where the states are weaning away from people at a certain age group and winding it back. So I'll send that to you later. There are some encouraging signs of that coming to fruition. I agree. It would have been nice to see it up front from day one. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. There's reasons why they're doing things. There's a systematic rollout I'm not privy to. I don't sit that high up, neither do you.
And if I may,
please
interrupt for a moment. Marty McCary just announced yesterday or the day before that they're altering the standards for the COVID-19 vaccines. They've altered the standards for they've got one standard for people 65 and above. They've got another standard for 65 and below who are at high risk, and then they have the third standard, which is for under 65, who are just the general population who are not at high risk. So we don't want to get into that. We'd be here all day. But
that was one of the articles I was going to send you. So if you've seen it, But I think that's how they're optically rolling it out for the masses who are not as ensconced as in the truther movement as I believe our audiences are, to introduce this like a frog in the pot, slow and systematic. Right now, I
hope you're right.
Well, I've got some information that seems to suggest that, which again I can send you at a later date. But yeah. But where my concern is, and what I think the overwhelming lion's share of our audience, and probably yours to some degree, would agree, is I would have liked to have seen the chemtrail issue that has been so pervasive, particularly here in California, Arizona, and throughout the country. I would have liked to have seen that addressed a lot quicker, and that is something that I'm praying that optimistically will come to fruition, here some point. So that I share your frustration on that with that respect. But we'll have to see how it all plays out. Reading your book a few times, it's clear that you are a heavy proponent, as I mentioned before, of the carnivore diet, even citing sources going back to the beginning of man in the wilderness, the forest, and detailing how they ate meat for strength and sustenance. At the same time, plant life was and still is abundant in present times. How did you determine that the need for vegetables, at least in a limited quantity in terms of a carbohydrate quota to stay in ketosis, was the best way to go for both yourself as well as others who have read or will read your book?
Okay. So first of all, one cannot go above a certain threshold of carbohydrate consumption and remain in ketosis. Ketosis, I wouldn't necessarily identify it as the absence of carbohydrates. I think that's going too far. But it is a condition that cannot be sustained if one passes that threshold of carb consumption in a 24-hour cycle. And I'm talking about repeatedly, not having a bad day, so to speak. So what is the correct amount of carbohydrates to stay in ketosis? Well, this is a good case of bioindividuality. Some people need to stay under 20 grams of carbs, some people under 30, some people under 40. There's even some people who can eat 50 grams of carbs a day and remain in ketosis. Not many, but there are some. Okay. So that's obviously, if we compare that, say, if we choose the number 30 grams just for this illustration, the average American male consumes 400 to 500 grams of carbohydrates a day. But if you want to stay in ketosis, again, we're using just as an average, you need to be less than 30. So that's quite a commitment, I think, for people who are uninformed and don't understand. Now, what about the consumption of vegetables? So first of all, we should say that there are essential proteins that you can only get through diet. You must eat them. There are essential fatty acids. You cannot make them. Your body will not make them. You have to get them through dietary form. There is no such equivalent in carbohydrates. There is no essential carbohydrates. I think that's quite telling if we excuse me, if we believe the human body functions in a logical, rational manner, which I happen to be a proponent of that position, then the fact that there's no equivalent in carbohydrates. In other words, a person could literally start today and never eat carbohydrates, not a single gram of carbohydrates for the rest of their life, and be amazingly healthy. You cannot say that about proteins, and you cannot say that about fats. There's no such thing as essential carbohydrates. That's number one. Number two, probably like me, John, you were raised with this narrative that you need to eat all your fruits and vegetables in order to get all the nutrients you need, blah, blah. Well, that turns out to be absolute bogus nonsense. Okay? Everything that the human body needs to not exist but thrive is contained in animal products. So, for instance, in my case, excluding like a little thin bit of onion on a burger that I lettuce wrap, something like that, I haven't eaten vegetables in 7 years. Here I am. I'm not dead. And with that, discussion of vegetables usually also turns to a discussion on fiber. That's another false medical industry narrative that you need fiber. In fact, research has shown people's bowel movements are less consistent and less quality, if I can use that word, with high consumption of fiber than being on a diet like the carnivore diet where there's virtually no fiber whatsoever. But you don't hear about those studies in the press.
Yeah.
So the narrative is very, very well protected.
No, well, you're helping to smash that. And I think people are searching for the truth, which tends to lead to a gateway to that anyway. So, yeah, I think it's fiber has proven itself in that regard to be sort of a passing fancy and has been perfunctory at best in its function, to your point. I wasn't actually planning on asking you this question, but if you'll indulge me, it's a bonus question because it's just something, it's something that as you were sharing, I was thinking about. So I'm athletic, you're athletic, obviously. I do basketball and lifting. You do a lot of lifting. I know we talked, you've been in the gym and so on and so forth. You spend a lot of time outdoors. There's a lot of discussion, particularly in the athletic community and to some extent the public at large as well, with respect to a cheat day. So let's say that you're doing a heavily, 95% carnivore based diet and all of its iterations, eggs and so forth. Do you subscribe to a cheat day 1 day a week, or do you throw that out about ketosis and just say we forget about it because it's an off day, or are you very strict about being ketosis 7 days a week? How do you look at that?
Okay, so I've never had a desire for a cheat day. It just doesn't interest me, so I'm not a good test case on that. However, let's talk about the very concept of a cheat day. Now, I think it's counterproductive, especially in the early months of ketosis. It's counterproductive to have a cheat day every week because normally a cheat day doesn't mean somebody goes from 30 grams of carbs to 36. Normally, it means they go from 30 grams to 250 or 300. That's not beneficial. If people want to cheat, that's okay. And I'm going to explain why in a minute. Okay. But I would advocate that if people want to cheat, they choose an occasion rather than a calendar date. So rather than saying I'm going to cheat every Saturday, they choose something like I'm going out with my buddies next month. So, we're going to drink beer, which has got a lot of carbohydrates. And or there's a birthday party and I want a little sliver of cake. Okay, that's fine. But try and make it an occasion rather than a date on the calendar, or a recurring event on the calendar. Now, once somebody their body is firmly entrenched in ketosis, and a good working definition of a body being firmly in ketosis is that the cells have no interest in using glucose for fuel. Zero. Okay. All they want is fatty acids. And that's a transitional thing that happens from the time you flip into ketosis And there's months, usually probably 7, 8, 9, 10 months before your body is fully what they call keto adapted or ketosis adapted. And that means the cells are just done with glucose. They have no interest. Okay. So what happens if somebody goes out and they have a piece of cake, or they have that beer we're talking about that's got a bunch of carbs in it, or some other cheat? Well, the body rebels. Virtually everybody I know who's been in long-term ketosis, who has a cheat day, and I don't mean going from 30 grams to 36, I mean a good cheat day, they feel like crap that evening. The next day, they literally feel sick. Which brings me to another point. Somebody who eats a lot of carbohydrates and then decides to eat a lot of animal product, they don't get ill. But somebody who eats animal products predominantly and then turns around and eat carbs, they get physically ill. I think that's another, again, for people who believe the body reacts rationally, that it has its logical systems, like an engineering project, if you will. The fact that somebody who's been eating animal products for a year and then they have a piece of chocolate cake and they get physically ill. A friend of mine, she went out and had a big ice cream sundae for her husband's birthday and literally went out in the parking lot and threw up, sick to her stomach. Okay. The fact that somebody who's eating predominantly proteins and fats turns around and eats carbs and gets physically ill should tell people something. And it doesn't work in the inverse. It doesn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like, as you're sharing it, my thought was, it's almost like you're talking about beers. If you were using your cheat day to do beers, and, you get the proverbial hangover that a lot of people get, the bender the day after. It's almost like your body is doing the equivalency of that with regard to food and the fuel intake, which is interesting. So
basically it's poison at that
sure,
point.
Well, yeah, that's how your body's treating it, because it's accustomed now to eating clean and healthy. So have you thought about, maybe you've talked about in other groups, I just haven't heard it, so I'm going to ask a question for our audience, for posterity. If somebody does have a cheat day, whether that's once a month, once every 6 months, or a birthday, as you said, do you have an idea of the recovery time it takes the body to get back into ketosis from said cheat day?
Good question. Thank you for asking it.
Sure.
A body that is well established in ketosis does not fall out of ketosis for a cheat day. Okay. The reason for that is the cells are rejecting glucose. They don't want any. Okay. So when somebody cheats and has that piece of chocolate cake, it doesn't change the cell's preference at that point. That's well established. The cells are in that groove, so to speak. They're not going to suddenly say, holy cow, John ate a piece of cake. We want to gobble up glucose for energy. That doesn't happen. It would take having a cheat day after a cheat day after a cheat day after a cheat day to reprogram those cells to want to consume glucose again. And I want to point out to your audience, and you know that I say this clearly in body science, the cells oxidizing glucose for energy is part of the body's emergency response to having way too many carbs in the system. Because we've grown up in this era of high carbohydrate consumption, the medical industry or the physiology industry says burning glucose is the way the body fuels the cells, which is completely inverse from the truth. Oxidizing glucose for energy is part of the body's mechanism of getting that crap out of the blood. It's like if you had a pile of trash, would you spend all day trying to bundle it up and get it somehow to the dump? Or if you had a furnace, would you just toss it all right into the furnace and burn it up? That's exactly what the cells are doing when they burn glucose for energy. They're taking all that crap that's in the blood and they're getting it out of the blood. It's an emergency mechanism. It's not the way nature intends our cells to be fueled.
Great answer. Thank you, David. And it also goes to re-illustrate your point earlier about how brilliantly intelligent and intuitive our body's design is in faith and also in logical, rational form. that it self-regulates or filters out as a catch mechanism, if you will, through the liver and other things. In keeping with the complementary differences between men's and women's bodies and overall muscular and skeletal structure, we cannot underscore the importance of exercise in conjunction with the properly based ketosis diet. And again, this is a general topic, but in general, what exercise regimens would you recommend for both sexes in order to maintain said optimal ketosis levels?
Good question. Thank you. So if we go back 50,000 years as an example, nobody was lifting rocks so they could say, "Hey, Bob, I'm lifting." Nobody did that. Their exercise they got exercise to exist. If they wanted to exist, their bodies got exercise. You want to build things, you want to move things, you want to hunt, you want to carry your buddy who broke his leg back to the tribe. You exercise to live, although they didn't consider it exercise at all, right? It's just you move your body if you want to live. And the same thing is true of the cardio side of it. I mean, during the hunt, there was a lot of running done, okay, in most cases. So, and the idea of play has always been in man's heart and his mind to play. Today we have this formalized thing. We have baseball, we have football, we have racquetball, but play has always been in human nature. So there would have been a lot of screwing around, especially with young people and teens, and sprinting and racing. And so it was just a part of the human experience to exercise. So with that as the backdrop, what I encourage people to do is simply resistance training of one form or another. I don't care whether you're out there deadlifting 450 pounds or you've got bands and you're exercising using bands at home. I don't care. Get the resistance training in and get the cardio training in. Now let's talk about resistance training for a moment. Sure. We talked about the lymphatic system a little bit ago. And the lymphatic system it would be difficult to understate the importance to our immune system of the lymph system. It is a critical part of our immune function. So lymph fluid, there's no pump like the heart for the cardiac system. Okay. So the way lymph fluid moves throughout the lymphatic system, which is all throughout your body, just like the blood system, is the contraction and release, contraction and release, contraction and release of skeletal muscle. So I'm just going to use my bicep as an example since you can see that on camera. If I want the lymph fluid to move, I contract and release and contract and release and contract and release. That act throughout my body moves the lymph fluid. Okay. So while a lot of people, like especially men, they'll go to the gym and it's chest day, and that's all they do. They do a bunch of sets of chest. After going into ketosis more than 7 years ago and evaluating exercise for its true purpose rather than the vanity or the accomplishment side of it, now I try and work upper body and lower body every day because I want to move that lymphatic fluid. Mm-hmm. And of course, I don't think I need to explain the benefit of causing the blood and the heart to move more rapidly, the blood to move more rapidly throughout the body and the heart to facilitate that. I think here in 2025, everybody knows the benefits of cardio. However, I would say this, there is no health benefit to extreme cardio. Okay. Now, I'm not talking about performance benefit, just general health benefit. So if somebody, I'm going to use arbitrary numbers here. If somebody goes out and runs 3 miles and each mile is, I don't know, a 10-minute mile, that person is their cardio system, the entire system that functions, will be healthy. The guy that goes out and runs 3 miles at 6.5 minutes a mile, he's going to have better running performance, but his general health is not going to be any different than the guy who runs the 10-minute miles. Make sense?
Yeah, completely. Thank you for that. Okay. Just want to give people sort of a baseline of maybe a regimen if they don't have that discipline. It kind of gives them a gateway, a roadmap to doing that. And so
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. We talked about your you talked about going to your doctor. So, we've touched on this before, so this will be familiar to you. With respect to going to your doctor for an annual physical, where do you weigh on in the discussion? And after a talk with you about the difference between standard glucose-based blood lab work versus the ketosis blood lab work that gets drawn up, how do you measure that, and how do you help people sort of, mentally prepare for the shift between those two worlds?
Sure. Another excellent question. So, first of all, I think that we need to go to the 35,000 foot level and acknowledge 100% of what the medical industry tells us is normal for our bodies is based on bodies in glucosis. The amount of research that's been done on people in ketosis is about as close to nil as you can get without actually being zero. I mean, for instance, the Navy SEALs have done some research into ketosis and so forth. A couple of researchers have done some research, but they do it for like 3 weeks and they're done. Okay. There's been really no research done into what the norms are for ketosis. So I asked this question to illustrate the point. What's the proper blood pressure for a person in ketosis? Who knows? Because nobody has taken a pool of people who've lived in ketosis for the sake of this illustration, we'll say a year, continuously in ketosis for a year, and taken all of their blood pressures across the line. Okay. That's the only way we know what the proper blood pressure is for a body in ketosis. Fasting blood sugar, right? The medical industry says it should be 99 or below. That's anything above that's problematic according to the health industry, or the unhealthy, the sick industry. However, what's the proper fasting blood sugar for a body in ketosis? Who knows? But I know from my consulting work with people who live in ketosis that it's very common for somebody in long-term ketosis to have a fasting blood glucose measurement of 101 or 103 or 105. And they're obviously consuming like 9 grams of carbs a day. They're not insulin resistant. They're not diabetic. And then you ask questions like, okay, so if your fasting blood sugar in ketosis is high by traditional standard, by glucose standard, is high every day, that's going to affect your A1C score. Okay, so there's all of these moving parts, and people often become concerned because some people, I'm going to use carnivore as an example. Some people launch into the carnivore diet. They're on carnivore for 4 months, and their cholesterol drops. Some people, I would be such an example. I've been in ketosis more than 7 years, more than 5 years eating carnivore, and my cholesterol is sky high, and by again glucose standards, and I love it because my body is producing cholesterol is a healing substance.
Right.
And I do a lot of brain work. I do a lot of physical work. And my body is producing the level of cholesterol that I need for my body to heal all the stuff I've got going on. And I don't mean heal that something's injured. That's not what I mean.
Right.
To heal in the sense of keeping my body healthy. And so people need to get over the whole cholesterol dynamic they've been programmed with, the false cholesterol dynamic they've been programmed with for the last 60 years.
Right.
But back to the people who are in ketosis, I provide consulting for people who want to have their blood tests interpreted because their doctors can't really interpret them correctly because their doctors don't know anything about ketosis. So the doctor may say, well, this is problematic, or that looks bad, or I have concerns about this. Oh, I need to put you on statins. Because the doctor, he got out of medical school 1,000 years ago. He hasn't kept up on the research, and he's just regurgitating medical industry dogma crap. So if you have any of your viewers who want personal consulting on their blood tests to understand how to interpret their blood tests in light of being in ketosis, they can always reach out to me.
Definitely. And also, as you know, Dave, I learned this from your book and part with others that your brain is at least 60% fat. So you want to
Yes.
propagate and encourage that because you just need to reverse engineer what we've been taught, just like with other things in life, financial and so forth. We've touched on the trust. And doctors, I've found largely times, my experience has been that doctors are not nutritionists. Their training in nutrition is woefully inadequate. And so they're just giving you the default of what they've been trained, which is large part an agenda.
Sure.
So, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. You want to?
I tell people in the public space all the time, if you want to have a heart attack, follow the advice of the American Heart Association. If you want to be a diabetic, follow the advice of the American Diabetic Association. The whole establishment dynamic is 180 degrees opposed from reality. But it serves a purpose. And that purpose is huge profits for big med, big pharma, and big food. That's the goal.
Exactly. And we see that with what just happened a week ago with prescription drugs coming down up to 80%. But this is a protracted conversation, but why I'm encouraged about that, Dave, is because I think that's leading to the ultimate introduction of med beds, which is not an excuse to not get healthy. It's just a pathway of the health that's going away from the allopathic industry we've known and the whole barbaric practices of that. It's very encouraging for what's to come on the horizon. That was my point.
Barbaric, good word, by the way, for that.
Yeah.
Fits perfectly.
Well, you hear it in movies so often, it starts to sink in, but I think it's quite apropos to your point. This is sort of a question that kind of circles back to the genesis of this podcast with you in the beginning, but I thought it bared repeating. As you said, all of our lives, we've been lied to by the American Medical Association about fat and carb, proper distribution, meat is bad for you and fat is bad for you, but have a certain amount of carbs and so on and so forth. You touched on that. Thankfully, your book flies contrapuntal to the American standard diet agenda. Can you articulate a little bit as to why the AMA is wrong and how the proper amount of meat intake as well as salt is actually quite good for you? And what the truth is in direct conflict from everything that we've been misled for many, many generations.
Sure. Thank you. So first of all, the only information the media puts out is what big food, big pharma, and big med wants put out. For instance, most Americans are unaware that there was a study that came to fruition around 2000 that showed women with high cholesterol live longer than women who don't have high cholesterol, right? Nobody's aware that study even exists, right? So when you ask, how do I know that the medical industry is wrong? Well, because I read these studies. So where the average American reads what they see in the press or they watch television, I actually spend my days reading these studies. So I know they exist, and I know, and I have looked at the fake science studies and broken down how their protocols were intended to come up with a preconceived conclusion and so forth. There's also just the obvious. And let me share one example. You've probably seen the headlines that high consumption of red meat is associated with type 2 diabetes. Okay. Now, It would be hard to imagine a more absurd claim. However, do we need to go to a science lab to prove that's wrong? No, we don't. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that there's 1 million Americans, which is far less than 1%, right? So let's say there's 1 million Americans eating carnivore right now. So you would expect then, in a community of 1 million people eating nothing but animal source food, primarily red meat, you would expect type 2 diabetes, according to the headline, according to that study's claim, you would expect the carnivore community to be rife with type 2 diabetes. In reality, you can't find a single person in the carnivore community that has type 2 diabetes. Okay. So it's simple enough to disprove them without even needing to go to the basis of science. All we have to do is use our sense of rational thought and observation to determine that they are completely false. Now, you mentioned salt, and I'm glad you did, because I want to talk about that. Mm-hmm. Ancient man consumed a lot more salt than we do today. There are several reasons for that. One of the modern reasons is salt has been vilified, right? Everybody's been told, cut your salt down. Again, just like all the other advice, this is If you want to be healthy, do exactly opposite of what they suggest. So,
Exactly.
and most Americans are probably not aware. If we go back in history, I mean, thousands of years ago, wars were fought for access to salt. Okay. That's how healthful it is. So I'm going to use I don't like to typically use myself as an example, but I think it's poignant here.
Sure.
Because I can't access the same kind of salty meats and whatnot that my ancestors did, my ancient ancestors, I consume probably in the neighborhood of about 3,000 grams of salt. I'm sorry, 3 grams, 3,000 units, 3 grams of salt via dietary consumption. I then consume another 11 to 12 grams of salt via supplementation.
Mhm.
So depending on the day, I'm at 13 to 15 grams of salt a day. Okay. The medical industry would tell you that anything over 2.3 grams is problematic for your health. So guess who's in incredible health?
Us.
Okay. At 13 to 15 grams every single day. And one of the things that some people complain of when they're in carnivore is that after they've been on carnivore for a while, they start getting like leg cramps at night, or they get cramps when they're exercising. So I didn't increase my salt for this reason, but coincidentally, when I increased my salt to the levels I just discussed, I mean, everybody gets an occasional leg cramp, but the kind of leg cramps that I got that I attributed to being in ketosis and the carnivore diet, as soon as I ate my salt, they all went away. So what I did is I put more sodium into the interstitial tissues of my body, which provided the level of cell-to-cell signaling that was necessary to prevent the cramps. I mean, this is, yeah, okay. So it's a little sciencey, but it's not rocket science.
You're right. It's interesting, Dave, because I've noticed since I've been on the largely based ketosis carnivore diet that we discussed a year ago, since I've been implementing it, I noticed weight loss within the first 10 days, very quick, just cutting out, bread and potatoes, for example.
Yeah.
Playing basketball between, proper stretching and, salt intake before and after. Typically I'll do like, steak and eggs after a workout, for example. And then I also use a very pure beet extract product in the water that helps open up my capillaries. I've noticed that my lactic acid effects in the calves, particularly basketball, is almost negligible.
Okay.
So to your point, in my own personal case study, I've noticed implementing salt in the protein, for example, I think has played a large role that's contributory to the lack of cramping or lactic acid buildup that's normally associated after that kind of workout.
May I share a personal experience about exercise and ketosis?
Of course.
So when I was living in glucose, so I've been in the gym 40 years. I've always been a big gym guy. And prior to when I was in glucoses, probably like most people, my muscles would get sore after the day or two after a workout. Guys that do a lot of bench pressing, they'll laugh about this. Your buddy comes up and he does this. He pokes you in the pec. You're like, yeah, right, because it's so sore. In ketosis, I don't get that anymore. But here's the interesting thing that I was not ready for. In glucoses, my muscles would be uncomfortable post-workout, right? They'd be sore, they'd be tight, whatever. In ketosis, I don't get sore like I used to ever, no matter how hard I push. But if I don't work a muscle group out, it lets me know. Everything starts tightening up. And the tightness is uncomfortable. So that's my body telling me, okay, at least in this part of your body, you're not moving. You're not getting the movement you need to. So for instance, if my back is really tight, I'll go into the gym and I'll do a tremendous back workout. And where most people in glucose would be like, oh God, I did a back workout. My back is like, thank you. And it doesn't hurt or feel tight or anything. That all of that goes away as soon as I work it.
No, you're absolutely right. Because again, using it in my world with basketball, I noticed a lot of guys afterwards are like, oh, my back is tensed up as opposed to their calves. And that's your body telling you, in my experience, that your core is not strong enough, that you need to increase your core to compensate. And
Right.
because I've been working a balance in my life between, core and cardio with, planks and certain push-ups, military style, I've noticed a stronger core. I haven't had as much of a problematic issue as I had in the past, like some of these guys are experiencing. So I can attest to what you're saying is validated through personal experience. So you're absolutely right. Well, Dave, as we close up this podcast for today, because I want to respect your time, as always, we're going to leave the link in the description for your book, Body Science. Where can people get it, and where can they find your work? And what last thoughts do you have for the audience today?
They can get the book at the website, which is Dr. Reality. That's drreality.news, not .com, .news. And if they want to reach out to me personally, they can reach out to me at dave@drreality.news.
Great. Any last thoughts for the audience today in general?
No, we've covered a lot of great things. Thank you for the wonderful questions.
Well, thanks for your professionalism and always having great deep dive intel. I appreciate it. And we'll, of course, folks, leave those links in the description as we have in the past. Dave Champion, we thank you for being here. Good sir. Nice to have you back as a reprise from last year. Appreciate you. We salute you on this posthumous Memorial Day coming up here for all of our friends and family who have served, past, present, and future. Thank you for your service. And we hope you have a great weekend. And we will look forward to bringing you back on again, hopefully next month, where you had some updates as far as the income tax, which will be exciting to hear what you have for that. So we'll leave that as a teaser.
All right. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Dave.
It's been a pleasure.
Talk to you soon.
I hope you enjoyed the interview. Let's take a moment and switch from health to income tax. I haven't filed an income tax return or paid a penny of income tax in 32 years. I wrote the best-selling book in the country that reveals the truth that the income tax doesn't apply to the vast majority of Americans. I speak about it nationally, and the United States Department of Justice's tax division has acknowledged having my book, Income Tax Shattering the Myths. So, why am I sitting here, free as a bird, never heard from the IRS, 32 years after filing my last income tax return? Simple. Because I'm different than 99.9% of the American public. How am I different? I'm different in that I've actually read what the law says. Let me briefly explain how society's understanding of income tax works. You pay income tax because you believe what people have told you. And those people told you you have to pay income tax because someone told them. And on it goes with millions of people telling millions of other people they are required to file and pay. All of those millions of people just repeating what somebody else told them. None of them ever bothering to look at the law. Unlike my fellow citizens 32 years ago, I decided I wanted to know whether what everybody was saying was true or not. So I read the law for myself. What a concept. I discovered that what everybody was telling me, and what they've been telling you, is not true. It's not factual. It's not what the law says. I totally get it when somebody says, I don't have the time to read through mountains of tax law. I understand, because it took me 17 years of reading tax law before I felt I had sufficient command of the mountains of incontrovertible facts to write Income Tax Shattering the Myths. My point is that you do not need to spend copious amounts of time that you don't have reading tax law to learn that you've been pumped full of government disinformation your whole life. All you need to do is read one single book, and you will know the truth of the income tax. Only when you know the truth can you decide whether you want to safely walk away from the scam and keep what's yours. The famous American philosopher Jon Dowling said, "A society that teaches conformity produces citizens who fear freedom." I believe we're there, and perhaps have been there for some time. If you are one of the remaining Americans who've not been socialized to fear freedom, you're going to love Income Tax Shattering the Myths. Right now, and for a limited time, you can get free shipping on Income Tax Shattering the Myths, and in fact, any order that contains Income Tax Shattering the Myths, by using the code TARIFS at checkout. If you get the 4-pack, it includes Body Science, Income Tax Shattering the Myths, and a couple of handbooks I'm sure you will love. Just enter tariffs at checkout, and I'll pay the shipping on your order. Thank you for being here. Take care. Have a great day.